What makes world building feel believable? Welcome to World Building Mastery, where I aim to teach you everything I know about world building. No AI is used on this channel. Today I will go over how to make your setting feel more believable and realistic, grounded and sensible, and what key elements might be detracting from that. I want to give you a working philosophy for how to approach realism, especially in a setting with very fantastical or theoretical elements, and why some settings are able to handle these with a high degree of believability, while others simply fail to meet the mark. This will help you to craft your worlds in a way which avoids such pitfalls, and which is far more captivating to your intended audience, whoever they may be. Let's begin. Part 1. What is believability? Everyone wants their setting to feel believable, as this is crucial to a good setting, but a lot of world builders struggle with this, because, well, as world builders we tend to, by nature, deal with a lot of fantastical and outlandish concepts which are inherently kind of unrealistic, because they're far removed from reality. And because of that, it can make it very challenging to integrate these elements into the world in a way which is believable. Because, well, fundamentally, if you're making a fantasy setting, it's a setting with all sorts of dragons, magic, etc., which obviously don't exist in the real world, so it's a challenge to make them believable, and the same applies to science fiction or alternate history or any other type of setting. But believability and realism aren't quite the same thing, and this is an important distinction. So, while realism is important to believability, and it's important to include certain elements of realism for the sake of believability, this is not sufficient, and it's not the primary means of achieving it either. Plenty of settings are extremely unrealistic in this sort of sense, but they're nonetheless very believable. So realism, such as, for example, hard sci-fi, is not inherently better, or inherently worse, or inherently more believable, even, but it is fun, it adds flavour to a setting, it is, it's a valid style, and it's something that's it can be very interesting. Real-world constraints often do make things more interesting. But any fictional setting is by definition not the real world, and so there is a fundamental limit on how realistic it can be in that sense. A purely realistic setting might easily become quite boring. Believability, then, refers to how well a setting is able to allow audiences to suspend their disbelief. Realism is objective. It's a measure of how well a setting conforms to what we consider to be the real laws of physics and things like that. Believability is more subjective. It depends on your audience and what they personally are willing to suspend their disbelief for. Obviously, no one is going into your setting and your writing projects actually convinced that any of it is actually real, presumably. But they put the knowledge that it isn't real aside for the sake of hearing about the fictional. This is what humans do when they play games and things like that. They separate the game world from the real world. This is what suspension of disbelief is. And believability is all about capturing and maintaining the audience's suspension of disbelief. So believability is subjective, realism is objective. That's the difference. So that leads us into part 2, which is suspension of disbelief. Now I've just given you a definition of believability and of suspension of disbelief. So let's talk a little bit more about both of those in some detail. Again, believability is how well a setting is able to allow audiences to suspend their disbelief. So it's about how well you maintain the suspension of disbelief. Now, all audience members will have some amount of suspension of disbelief, but how much, and more interestingly, in what areas they have suspension of disbelief, will vary wildly, and depends largely on their own worldview. And that's why it's important to know your audience and understand them, but there is a limit to how far it can go. There's always a limit of some kind, and that's why believability matters, because if you go past that point, the audience will lose investment in the world that you've created, because the fantasy breaks down, the game breaks down, the game doesn't work for them anymore. And this can happen for a number of reasons. As I say, believability is subjective, and what can cause it to be lost for one person may not cause it to be lost for another person. So it will vary depending on your audience, but there are a few key ways that you can lose it. So here's a list of key ways that believability can be lost. Number 1. This is the big one. The setting does not follow the rules that it sets out for itself, or it doesn't have any internal consistent rules that it adheres to at all. The real world is always bound up by rules and limitations, and so things without limitations often don't feel believable. If you have something that's just power scaled to the point of ridiculousness, it's very, very difficult to keep that believable, because in the real world we know that things are constrained by the laws of physics and the laws of reality. And it doesn't just apply to power scaling, but just anything that breaks the rules. This is famously in some of the Star Wars films. They've made some decisions there where they've just changed the law in ways that just break the rules of the setting, and people don't find it believable. So that's number 1. Number 2 is where things are excessively either utopian or dystopian, or just conform to some kind of archetype. And there isn't really a sense of balance in the setting. So it's either everything is, grim, dark, pure misery fest, misery porn is a term for it. If you have a setting like that, or you have a setting that's the exact opposite, where it's just utopian and everything is wonderful for everyone, neither of those, or A, they're not that interesting, and B, they're not really that believable. So you need to have some sense of balance, and I'll get into that in more detail later on. So number 3 is that things in the setting are too logical and not as messy as the real world, which can make a setting feel very artificial and designed. Now, you do need a certain degree of orderliness to make a setting, as an art piece, because settings aren't necessarily meant to be depictions of reality. As I say, they're all inherently unrealistic to some degree. So they do need some sense of orderliness. But that ordered design, it needs to be obscured in a way. And I'll get into how to obscure that again later on. There is a term for this that I really like, called moldy world building. I think that came from a channel called Curious Archive, but regardless, I like that term, and again, we'll get into that in more detail, but yeah. Number 4, this one is kind of vague, but the vibes just feel off. It's like you have too many contradictory elements in a setting without a consistent tone or theme. Like you have too many ridiculous... if you have vampires in your setting, that's fine. But you have vampires meeting with UFOs on Mars to discuss the future of the Third Reich. I don't know. Something ridiculous like that. If you haven't, that could be a vibe to be honest. But if you have something that's just too ridiculous and out of whack, like if you have a hard sci-fi setting, like Interstellar or something like that, or Project Hail Mary. If you have a setting that's that type of hard sci-fi, and then randomly you introduce like a dragon or like something like that, that's like very clearly a fantasy element, it feels so completely out of tone and out of whack with the rest of the setting that can destroy the whole sense of believability that you built. So number 5 is that the audience doesn't have any points of familiarity to attach themselves to in the setting. Everything is just too different and alien to them. So this is less, this only really applies to settings that are very far removed from our reality. So if it's a setting that's, for example, a near future setting, this is much easier to pull off. But if it's a setting that's far future or complete different fantasy world, what can happen is there's too much fictional elements, and it's all fictional elements. You don't have the day-to-day normal stuff that people understand. You don't have people going to work. You don't have people complaining about the weather. You don't have all these, standard things that real life has that make the real world believable. So if there's an absence of that, the audience will feel that absence. Maybe not consciously, but they will feel it. So that's number 5. And number 6, this is the final one on my list, which is when there's supposed to be this much vaster world with all its complexity, and you're saying that there's this big galaxy out there or something, which the story is taking place within, but none of this is actually seen or really heard from in any way, which affects things. And it can feel a lot like the setting as a whole doesn't really exist or matter outside of the characters or the exact story that happens. This is one final way where believability can be lost. Now, notably absent from that list is the setting having too many fantasy elements. Very rarely is an idea simply too fantastical or theoretical to be believable if it's handled intelligently. There is difficulty to it, of course, but it is very rare, if it ever happens at all, that an idea is too crazy or too outlandish or too far removed from reality for it to work. Of course, there are audience members who will find anything remotely non-existent to be absurd, science fiction, or whatever. But of course, you're always going to have audience members like that, and no matter what you do, your setting will not be believable to everyone. As I say, believability is subjective, so however well constructed your setting is, there will be some people who don't find it believable. So you can't please everyone, you have to choose who you're willing to please, and that's more or less going to be people like you. And, there's also the flip side of this. There are audience members who will jump to all sorts of radical conclusions about how much of, fiction is actually possible. The sort of people who say, they see stuff like nanotech, as it's often depicted, as, this magic wand technology, and they assume that could exist in reality. Whereas, anyone who's actually looked into it will know that the nanotech that scientists talk about and the nanotech that exists on, in movies is very, very different. They're not the same thing at all. But yeah, that's the point I was making, is any idea, no matter how outlandish, can be believable if it's handled properly. At least to some people, at least to a lot of people. Now, that being said, including fantasy elements for the sake of it, or, fantastical elements, it can only go so far. This is basically the rule of cool, which is, it's a whole topic unto itself. But I do want to talk about the rule of cool a little bit, because the rule of cool is always a trade-off of believability for the sake of cool points. If you go too far with it, and you kind of abuse it as a justification for everything, the setting loses any sense of seriousness, and it becomes essentially a children's toy. Which isn't inherently a bad thing, it can be fine, but it can be a bad thing if it isn't what you're going for, essentially. So the rule of cool, I would say to use it sparingly. Use it, but don't abuse it. Because abusing the rule of cool will also destroy your setting's sense of believability. So that's worth bearing in mind. So, part 3. How to actually make your setting more grounded and believable. So putting all of this into practice now. So I just gave you a list of things that can make a setting lose believability. And now I'm going to give you kind of the reverse of that. I'm going to give you a step-by-step guide to ensuring that your setting maintains that believability. And remember, the audience's believability is subjective. So, step 1. Know your audience. Know your genre, and know what other pieces of media exist in your genre. This is something you probably know already, really, but it's just worth highlighting. Know what other pieces of media exist in your genre and what tropes they tend to follow. Tropes are important because things only become tropes if they are believable enough to have some degree of widespread appeal. So a large number of your prospective audience already find this thing to be believable. Then it becomes a trope. So anything which is a trope within your genre is something which your target audience will tend to find believable enough. So get a sense of their worldview, their perspective on reality. Naturally, you are world building from your own perspective, from the perspective of your own worldview, and your target audience likely consists of people with a relatively similar worldview to your own. So you can also largely focus on things you genuinely believe could exist, or at least function logically. That's another way to build things that your audience is likely to find believable. So, step 1, know your audience. Next, you need to decide upon the basic logic of your setting. I go into this more specifically in some of my other videos, especially my first video on how to start a world building project. But as early as possible in your world building process, it's good to decide upon a few core themes and ideas which will define your project, your genre, your tone, And then make a list of rules for yourself to ensure that the setting sticks to these principles. Giving yourself rules, it helps to ensure a sense of cohesion and clarity and direction, which is very, very difficult to attain organically if you haven't made rules for yourself that outline exactly what you're trying to do. Although it is possible, and it does depend, but generally I think it's a very good idea to decide upon the core themes, the core logic, and make rules for yourself to ensure that you stick to those things. So, step 3. In addition to the external logic, your own rules, you need to decide upon the internal logic of how the setting itself works. This can mean things like laying out rules for your magic system or what technologies are available, things like that. But it can also be more generalized things, like which resources are abundant and scarce, what political and economic realities constrain the world, and what those mean in practice. You need to decide upon these things and write them down if you want to be consistent with these things. And the consistency of these things is what will, well, it won't necessarily make your setting believable, but it will protect your setting from something which could make it unbelievable. You don't need to go too deep into these. You certainly can, and there's many benefits to doing so. If you want to, then go ahead. As long as you have a general understanding of it, though, you're probably good. So it's basically the 80-20 rule. You do 20% of the work and you'll get 80% of the result. It's one of those things. Next, once you have some rules for yourself as the creator of the setting, and also some understanding of the internal logic of the setting, you need to give your setting a few key points of reality to keep it grounded. This doesn't necessarily mean things like the laws of physics or the macro scale internal rules. That's basically optional, sort of. What I'm talking about is more stuff like, what food do people eat day to day? What is their employment, or what do they do for work? What do they do in their free time? What do they do for rest and relaxation? Just normal life things. And that applies to everyone within the setting, so whatever perspectives. Just show the normal day-to-day stuff. Show the mundane. Show the news forecast. Show the, I don't know, just random bullshit that crops up in real life. Also, more macro scale stuff, like, familiar biomes or familiar political systems. Anything that will be familiar to the audience. Anything that they can look at and say, hey, I know what that is, that's familiar to me. You can have as many wild fantasy elements as you like within a setting. As I say, there's almost nothing that can't work. But as many, you can have as many spaceships, as many magic dragons, whatever, shape-shifting, interdimensional anime girls, anything you want. Just don't forget to include the mundane. It's the mundane elements of a setting that give the audience a sense of perspective on the fantasy elements. And seeing them next to one another is what helps to bridge the gap and make the fantasy elements believable. So include the mundane. Next, you can now make the history, and by extension things in the present, of your setting messier. Messiness is the goal. I mentioned this earlier with moldy world building. Again, I think Curious Archive made a video about this, which I recommend that you go and watch because it's very good. But basically, the real world is inherently messy. Things fall apart, things break down, and if your setting feels too pristine, it doesn't feel believable. So make it messy in the same way that the real world feels messy. People can hardly keep their own lives in accordance with a strict plan, so imagine how much harder it is to keep large-scale institutions to one ideal over an extended period of time. It's basically impossible. Everyone has their own goals, their own plans, and none of them are overarching and dominant to such an extent that they can silence all of the others and dominate history. So history of your world, as well as the present and political, economic landscape, etc., will be a mishmash of all sorts of competing forces, each acting predominantly in accordance with their own interests. And sometimes not even that. So a world history needs to have this sense of messiness to it. It needs to have just random things that, or seemingly random things that occasionally crop up and have to be dealt with. It needs to feel unpredictable in order to feel believable. And it also needs, this ties in with this, but this is why it's called moldy world building, you need some degree of ruin, some degree of decay and loss, and a sense of things breaking down. Nothing really remains shiny and pristine for very long at all. It's almost instant how things stop seeming that way. And seeing things in a run-down or ruined state will add to this sense of messy reality. So you can show spaceships, but show them held together with basically duct tape, for example. You can have big castles, but show old castles that no one uses anymore, which are in a state of disrepair. Show rusty suspension bridges with sections that have fallen into the sea. Show things covered in moss, Show things that are moldy. This is why it's called moldy world building. So include enough of this messiness, enough of this, incoherence, in order for the setting to feel believable. Finally, I think this is the final step. You need to approach world building like it's an iceberg. I'm sure you've heard the analogy of the iceberg where it's, most of it is underwater, you only see the tip. You can't construct the entire world. It's just not possible. Whatever your world building project is, however small in scale it is, but it's probably, decently big, you can never construct the entire world. It's just not possible. You can never explore everything. And even within a single story, you can never explore everything that you have created and have lore for, probably. I might make an entire video about the iceberg method, so let me know if that's something you'd be interested in. But instead of thinking about trying to explain your world, which a lot of beginners do, and it's a mistake in my opinion, think about how to do the exact opposite. Think about making your world mysterious. Think about raising questions in the audience's mind. Don't think about answering their questions. Think about raising more questions, because that will get them more invested. A great setting does not seek to answer all of the questions right away. It doesn't seek to give you this massive exposition dump. It seeks to hook you, right? And you have to hook them with a question, or with many questions. That's what a hook is. It's a question. So give the audience questions that they will want the answers to. Show them a narrow slice of the most interesting aspects of your setting, and of each aspect of your setting. Show them give them a taste, and leave a lot of aspects unexplained. Give them a lot of blanks to fill in, a lot of empty spaces in your lore, or lacks of, places where explanation is lacking. That's what will sell believability. Believability lies in not knowing everything. If you don't know everything, it's much more believable. So I think that's basically all of the steps. If you do all of these things, I guarantee your setting will feel more believable and more grounded than it would otherwise. Again, none of this guarantees that a given audience member will go into your setting and say, this is believable. Maybe they won't exactly say it, but none of this guarantees that everyone will find it believable. There will always be some people who don't. But I think in general, this will increase the number of people who do find your setting believable, if that is your goal. Which sometimes it isn't. Sometimes you do want to have a setting that's just unbelievable. Sometimes you want to have a setting that's unbelievably cool, or unbelievably ridiculous, or unbelievably whimsical. You can go for that, but if you do actually want to make your setting believable, it is important if you want to take it seriously to any extent, really. Follow this. So, this video has been part of a series I've been doing on how to world build. If it has been helpful to you, then go ahead and check out the rest of the series, because the advice I give in my other videos is just as good. If you're even more committed to improving world building, then in the description below you'll find a link to my paid community. I'm making a full course on world building, which will be posted there soon. My mission statement of world building mastery, is to create the greatest community of world builders and writers that exists on the internet, from whom the greatest artists of our generation will be born. So that's the mission statement. If you like that, here we are. You know what to do. In any case, thanks for watching, and I'll have more content to come soon. Bye.